Yes.
So I'm going to deal briefly now with the centre at the Walton Hospital. It was a recognised haemophilia centre in the sense that it had a UK HCDO number 66. It was a very small centre, which we'll see from the numbers treated. The director in the 1970s was Dr. Patricia Robb, and then from 1980, Dr. P.A. Stevenson. Dr. McVery, whose time in Liverpool was 1980 to 1985, says he had no involvement himself with the Walton Hospital, and he wasn't even aware that there was such a centre there. And it does appear that over the course of the early 80s, there were very few patients treated at the Walton, and such patients as had been treated there may have transferred to the centre in Liverpool. There are no returns after 1985, and by 1990 it's been recorded that there is no longer a haemophilia centre at the Walton. There's comparatively little information about what the source of products would have been. We know that the Regional Transfusion Centre in Liverpool provided some blood or blood products, or at least cryoprecipitate, in the 70s to the Walton. Dr. Stevenson does appear to have attended some of the regional meetings of the Mersey and North Wales haematologists in the course of the 1980s. And there's reference to Dr. Stevenson raising an issue in November 85 about difficulties in obtaining supplies of fresh frozen plasma. In terms of treatment, the numbers treated at the Walton from 1976 onwards were as follows: 5 patients in 1976, 5 in 1977, 4 with haemophilia A, 1 von Willebrand's, 4 haemophilia A patients in 78, 3 patients in 79, 3 patients in 1980, 2 with haemophilia, 1 a carrier, 2 patients with haemophilia A in 1981. 1982, it's not entirely clear, but may have been a single haemophilia A carrier patient. No patients treated in 1983, and 1 patient treated in 1984, but someone who was probably a visitor from Edinburgh rather than a registered patient at Walton. There are documents that suggest that there was a slightly larger number of patients, around 9 or so, registered at the Walton in the early part of the 1980s, but the number treated, as I say, rather smaller. In terms of the annual returns, what they show essentially is 1976 treatment with cryoprecipitate, in 1977 treatment with cryoprecipitate and a small amount of NHS factor concentrate. And it would appear that there was home treatment with cryoprecipitate in 1977. That's what the return seems to suggest. Again, 1978, mostly cryoprecipitate with some NHS concentrate and a small amount of fresh frozen plasma. The first year in which there's any commercial concentrate recorded is 1979. It's still predominantly cryoprecipitate, so it's 55,000 odd units, but 6,000 odd units of commercial concentrate, factor 8. In 1980, it's cryoprecipitate. 1981, cryoprecipitate. 1982, it's unclear, but it appears to be NHS factor concentrate only. As I said, no patients in 1983, and then a tiny amount of cryoprecipitate in 1984. The picture that emerges, therefore, is predominantly the use of cryoprecipitate with 1 year of a small amount of commercial concentrate. There's little information to reveal what, as a matter of fact, either Dr. Robb or Dr. Under Stevenson's knowledge of the risks of hepatitis or HIV might have been. Dr. Robb doesn't appear to have attended many UK HCDO meetings. The second half of the 1970s has Dr. Robb attending the meeting in 1977 only. Dr. Stevenson's not recorded as attending UK HCDO meetings in the 1980s. And there is no information to suggest patients infected with HIV at the Walton Centre. in relation to hepatitis C, the evidence the inquiry has received is in relation to patients infected with hepatitis C following a blood transfusion. So that, sir, is the position in relation to Walton. We move then to Scotland and to Inverness. So the Haemophilia Centre in Scotland, described by its director in the late 70s as the smallest centre in the UK, was located at the Raigmore Hospital in Inverness. Dr. Cook was the director through the 70s until his death in 1982, and he is minuted as having attended UK HCDO meetings from, I think, 1968 onwards. And then following Dr. Cook's death, Dr. Taylor became the director in 1982-1983. Dr. William Murray was a consultant haematologist involved with the care of patients from 1987 until 2010, and the haemophilia service was then taken over by Dr. Craig. In terms of facilities, we have a description from a witness treated at the centre in the early 1980s, describing a lack of facilities. Children dealt together with adults as the haematology centre was essentially a tiny room. As was common in Scotland, there were close links between the blood transfusion service and the provision of haemophilia care. And Dr. Cook, who, as director of the centre, was also the regional director of the North of Scotland Blood Transfusion Service from 1960 to 1982. We've put a little bit of information in our written note about the transfusion service, but we're going to be looking in more detail at hearings later in the year in relation to the blood services across the United Kingdom, so we'll no doubt come back to those issues. In terms of the numbers of patients registered or treated at the centre, in the 70s the figures seem to be between 14 and 18 patients on an annual basis. And the returns indicate that the treatment provided was almost exclusively Edinburgh factor 8 and 9, and that commercial products were not used. I'll just look at a couple of returns by way of example. So if we go to HCDO 402503, please, Shomik. I've given you too many
three zeros.
Sorry,
it must be.
HCDO 302503, my apologies. So we can see here the annual return for 1976, the director, Dr. Ian Cook, 20 patients treated during the year, and then we can see in terms of usage, 10,720 units of cryoprecipitate, but the bulk of the treatment is with Scottish NHS concentrate, 182,950. That's pretty much the pattern we see. If we then look at the 1977 return, HCDO 302504. We can see 19 patients treated, presumably haemophilia A patients treated, and 1 Christmas disease patient treated. And if we look towards the bottom of the entry, so no cryoprecipitate usage recorded, other materials identified as factor 8 Edinburgh, 144,780 units. If we look over the page, please, we can see a separate form in relation to home treatment. And the figure there given is 35,270 units of Edinburgh factor VIII for home treatment. And if we look at the comment below, we can see it said it's our intention to increase the number of patients on home treatment in the next 5-year period in view of the difficult problems occurring from long distances to this centre in a scattered community. And then it's really a similar pattern as we go through the years. So HCDO 302505. Just wait till that's turned around. So 18 haemophilic patients treated, no haemophilia B patients treated that year. There's one patient with factor VIII antibodies. If we go to the bottom, we'll see the sole product identified there is the Edinburgh factor VIII, 165,690 units. And there are, in relation to that year, identified on the various forms that are attached, I think 2 patients on regular home therapy. If we go to the return for 1979, HCDO 302506, we can see 20 patients, haemophilic patients treated during the year, 1 haemophilia B patient treated. And then we can see, again, it's Edinburgh concentrates being used for factor VIII, 151,210, and then factor IX, 5,100 units approximately. And that's really the pattern that continues, so I won't go through all the rest of the returns. But again, 1980, it's 15 patients with haemophilia A treated, 1 haemophilia B, only Edinburgh factor concentrates recorded. The same is true for 1981, when there's 12 haemophilia A patients, 1 haemophilia B patient, again, only Edinburgh factor concentrates recorded. If we go then in relation to 1982 to HCDO 302509, we'll see a letter from Dr. Discombe, a locum consultant haematologist, to Ms. Spooner at Oxford, and it records that he's having a certain amount of trouble in compiling the data requested because Dr. Cook died in August. I arrived, so that's 1982, I arrived in late November, and there's been considerable difficulty with some of our outstations, which appear to be unable to maintain the desired records. And Dr. Discombe refers to trying to get the information into a reasonable pattern. He says in the next paragraph, preliminary studies suggest that 5 haemophilia A patients were treated under the control of the laboratory. All 5 were on home treatment, a total of 1,357 bottles of factor VIII concentrate, all from Edinburgh, used. So far, I found no evidence that factor IX concentrate has been used for haemophilia B. As yet, we've not verified the data required about the presence of inhibitors, but as far as I can see, none of these patients have acquired one. We're doing our best to acquire the appropriate information. That would appear to be something of a probably of an underestimate in terms of the number of patients treated, but that represents the snapshot at the time. If we go to the second page of this document, it's a follow-up letter in July of 1983 from the Transfusion Service to Miss Spooner. And if we look at the last paragraph, it says, I regret the records are far from complete or guaranteed. When we get ourselves sorted out with a proper filing system in respect of the Haemophilia Centre, the statistics will again be accurate. And then if we just look at 1983, which is HCDO 302510, and we go to page 4, we can see there Dr. Taylor now identified as the director, 13 haemophilia A patients, 1 von Willebrands, and then we have the figures, NHS factor VIII concentrate, no reason to think that's anything other than Edinburgh concentrate, and the figures given for inpatient and home therapy, so 183,360 hospital treatment, 176,580 home treatment, and then some cryoprecipitate and some NHS concentrate used for the treatment of patients with von Willebrands. And the same pattern, 1984 and 85, 16 haemophilia A patients, 2 haemophilia B for 1984, only Edinburgh factor concentrates recorded. 1985 records the treatment of 10 haemophilia A and 1 haemophilia B patient, again, only the NHS Edinburgh factor concentrates recorded. We see, when we look at 1986, which is HCDO 302513, the recording of, at the bottom of the page, sorry, the recording of DDAVP for the first time. But again, the main product used is the Edinburgh concentrates. And then if we just look at a handful of bits and pieces of correspondence, we can see that there's correspondence between Dr. Cook and John Watt at the PFC. And indeed correspondence with Dr. Cook and others. If we just look at SBTS 40309_040. It's a response to an inquiry about factor 8 concentrate, June 1973, and Dr. Cook writes to Dr. Watt saying, although I'm in charge of the Haemophilia Centre here, the number of haemophiliacs I have is only 16. It's just not possible to undertake any research into a new product, as these people are so scattered and one cannot obtain the required specimens or the follow-up needed. The main decisions about this material will obviously need to be taken in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and I'll be interested to hear what is decided in due course. So it sounds like an invitation to participate in some form of trial or study in relation to a new SNBTS PFC product. And then if we look at SBTS 40309_159, we'll see again a letter from Dr. Cook to Dr. Watt. This is 23rd of September 1975, and it just gives an indication of what Dr. Cook's approach to treatment may have been. If we go further down the page, we can see halfway down that paragraph beginning, this is not a quibble. He says this, it did seem from last week's meeting that the really severe haemophiliacs might well need a dose twice weekly, which would mean that, and then 2 patients identified, could well use up the 12 ampules between them. This is no doubt being very greedy at the start. I feel they're extremely fortunate to be given even 1 dose on a regular basis. But I would like to hear whether it's possible that the amount to Inverness might be increased from 12 to 18, and if so, at what future date. No doubt my plan is too ambitious at this stage, but you will, I'm sure, appreciate that these demanding patients and their relatives do like to know where they stand. And it appears that Dr. Cook was keen on being able to provide a greater amount and more regular treatment to some, at least, of the more severely affected patients. There are then various letters. I'm not proposing to go through them in any detail, in 1975, showing a degree of fluctuating availability of product. So in October 75, Dr. Cook wrote saying, we've got a shortfall of factor 8, we've had to return to making more cryoprecipitate. However, by the end of that year, he says, well, we're getting the lion's share of factor 8 over the last 3 months. This is unfair. We're going to return to using cryoprecipitate and restrict our factor 8 to a couple of severe haemophiliacs to restore the balance of fair play, as he puts it, between the smaller centres. He raised concerns about supply of factor 8 in 1977 and talked about having to rely again on cryoprecipitate. By July of 1979, there's correspondence suggesting that there were 3 haemophiliacs at that stage at the centre on home treatment. and Dr. Cook is there now saying he's got an excess of factor VIII stock. And in 1981, he offered to reduce his factor VIII allocation and says, I'll be the first to shout if I think my 16 haemophiliac patients are being inadequately treated in the long term. The conclusions of the Penrose inquiry in terms of the factual position in relation to this centre was that between 1981 and 1985, almost no cryoprecipitate was used. That appears to be broadly consistent with the returns, and that only SNBTS products were used at the centre from 1974 onwards, and that heat-treated products were supplied to the centre in December of 1984. So that's the position in relation to what products were used as a matter of fact. There's no particular documentation casting any light on the policies or approaches towards treatment of different categories of patient. There's also little information about either Dr. Cook's or Dr. Taylor's knowledge of non-A, non-B hepatitis. They did, however, attend a number of UK HCDO meetings and also local meetings of Scottish directors at which there were discussions about hepatitis risks. And of course, Dr. Cook, in his role within the transfusion service, was part of decision-making in Scotland about the screening of blood donors for hepatitis in the early 1970s. And again, we'll probably no doubt come back to this when we look at the blood services later in the year, but we've identified in our note some correspondence from Dr. Cook in relation to the introduction of hepatitis screening in the early 1970s. He's said by 1975 to be testing every specimen for hepatitis B, and there's again an interesting exchange of letters between Dr. Cook and Dr. Cash that we may want to look at in more detail when we examine the role of the blood services. In terms of knowledge of risk of AIDS and response to risk, as we've heard, Dr. Cook died in I think August of 1982. The first meeting I have identified Dr. Taylor attending, where issues relating to AIDS were discussed, was a meeting in January of 1983. That is at, give me a moment, PRSE 301736. So we can see it's the minutes of the meeting of directors of the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service and Haemophilia directors held in St Andrew's House on Friday 21st of January 1983. And we can see present towards the bottom of the list of attendees Dr. Taylor. And then if we go to the last, no, sorry, not the last page, the 7th page, please, Shomek. We can see item 6, about halfway down the page, is headed Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, AIDS. Dr. Cash drew members' attention to recent articles in the United States and also in the Observer and the Lancet about this problem. A MMWR extract had been circulated with his paper. That seemed likely, given the timing, to be the December 1982 MMWR. Dr. Ludlam informed members that in the UK a letter and questionnaire had been sent out to haemophilia directors. In fact, I think the position is there was a plan to send that letter out, and it was actually sent out in March of 1983. But in any event, there is Dr. Taylor receiving, in January 1983, what appears to be an update of the factual position in terms of those infected.
Do we actually have a date for the time in January?
The meeting is the 21st of January.
Thank you.
And of course, we have present, amongst others, Dr. Forbes and Dr. Ludlam. We've explored with Dr. Ludlam, obviously, directly his knowledge and involvement in matters at the time. We've got the Immuno meeting taking place at London Airport in the same month, and so on. We know there were reference centre director meetings going on in February of 1983. So no reason to think that that kind of information wouldn't be communicated to the directors of the smaller centres, and this seems to be precisely what this minute of the meeting was doing. We can see that Dr. Taylor also attended a later meeting in February of 1984 of the same group, PRSE 301556. So it's 2nd of February 1984. Dr. Taylor's in the list of attendees. And if we go to the second page, I think this is a document we looked at with Professor Ludlam. But just a little further down, so the paragraph, little Roman 2, members discussed the suggestion that the production of cryoprecipitate could now be reduced. Dr. Ludlam said that cryoprecipitate was preferred in the treatment of children at present because of the new danger of AIDS. Dr. Han concurred. Policy seemed to be emerging, however, to use less cryo for haemophilia A patients. It was agreed that a certain minimal amount of cryo was required, and Dr. Cash pointed out that TDs could produce it in emergencies. And then there's a reference to the phasing in of heat-treated factor 8. Again, Dr. Taylor present at that meeting and for that discussion. In terms then of the arrangements for patients to be tested for HTLV3 and informed of their diagnosis, Professor Ludlam told us he sent out invitations to a range of centres or patients at centres in respect of that group meeting that was held in Edinburgh in December 1984. There's no evidence we've detected of Inverness patients attending that. However, we then have a template letter signed by Dr. Taylor from February 1985, which is at HIGH 5011. So we can see it's a draft dated the 12th of February 1985, dear, and then it presumably intended to be sent to the patients of the centre. As you are no doubt aware, there is considerable disquiet among people with haemophilia throughout the country about the subject of AIDS, and we have had several inquiries from patients. Reports in the press and on television are often biased and may be misleading. For this reason, I am enclosing some notes which we've compiled in the hope that we can answer the questions most commonly asked. It is simply a summary of what we know at present about this disorder, together with a few points of advice on how to minimise risk and brief details of the steps we are taking to combat the disorder. Obviously, some people will have questions which are not covered in this short document, and if you have any queries, we will be very happy to talk to you about them either over the telephone or by appointment. With a large amount of research being done at present, our state of knowledge changes rapidly, and we will try to keep you updated. In the meantime, I hope the enclosed document is of some help. We haven't, I think, got the document, but it may be it's in the same or similar form to the document that we looked at during Professor Ludlam's evidence that was being produced for circulation to patients. And then in terms of inviting patients to be tested, there's a second template draft letter of the same date, 12th of February 85, at HIGH 5012. Dear blank, because of the recent problems with AIDS, we are now producing new types of coagulation factors. Before this can be issued, we need to do a blood test on each of our patients. Could you please telephone us here to discuss the most convenient, I don't know whether that's going to be time or way, for you to have this done. Now, whether that's the only invitation that was issued or whether more information was given, we're not currently clear. But obviously, if that is the only communication, it doesn't explain what the blood test is for, if that's intended to be an invitation to be tested for HTLV3. If we then just look at some information we have about patients being told of their test results, we can look at a letter from Dr. Pettigrew, GMCO 301690_055. This is a letter from Dr. Pettigrew to Dr. Taylor in Inverness about a patient who was formerly a patient at the Royal Hospital for Sick Children. Dr. Pettigrew is seemingly informing Dr. Taylor that this patient, presumably someone who may now be coming under Dr. Taylor's care and had received mainly commercial factor VIII concentrate, had been tested, or their stored samples have been tested by Dr. Follett and found to be HTLV3 positive. And Dr. Pettigrew says, I thought you ought to be informed so that you can arrange for appropriate measures to be undertaken. Now, the inquiry has got evidence from the patient who is the subject of the letter, whose recollection is of their parents being told of the HIV infection in around 1987, 1988, so 2, possibly 3 years on from this, being told by Dr. Taylor. That witness's account is when his parents asked why they'd not been told earlier, the doctor said that it was not hospital policy to tell patients. That issue appears to have triggered a letter from the Haemophilia Society, which is at LOTH 606_028. It's a letter from Mr. Waters, and it's to Dr. Ritzer, 22nd of May 1989, but it concerns patients in Inverness and Aberdeen. I've learnt recently that patients with haemophilia attending Regmoor Hospital in Inverness and Aberdeen Royal Infirmary are not necessarily being advised of their HIV status. This came to light recently when a boy of 14 was suddenly told of his HIV antibody status, his parents having assumed, in the lack of any information to the contrary, that he was negative. I also understand that there are 2 patients at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary where there was a long delay in giving the information to the patients or their families. And Mr. Waters is asking Dr. Ritzer if UKHCGO has some policy on this which could be circulated. And certainly the evidence that the inquiry has received from some witnesses is to the effect that patients were seen from their medical records that they were being tested for HTLV3, but they were not told at the time that they were being tested. There's another letter from Dr. Taylor in October 1988, which may cast some further light upon that. It's at HIGH, let me just find it, 5020. It starts with a letter dated the 6th of September 1988, addressed to the Registrar of the General Medical Council, and it's from a Dr. McClure, described as the Honorary Secretary of the Area Medical Committee of the Ayrshire and Arran Health Board. And it refers to a publication from the GMC entitled HIV Infection and AIDS, the Ethical Considerations, which I think we looked at in a presentation a few weeks ago. Doctors in this area, as doctors elsewhere, have received the above document from the General Medical Council. Sufficient concern has been expressed by individual members of the profession in Ayrshire and Arran to warrant discussion by the Area Medical Committee. Following this discussion, I've been asked to write to you to express our unanimous view that while we will of course abide by the advice given, we disagree with the requirements imposed on the medical profession. We object to the advice on 2 grounds. Firstly, we do not feel that AIDS should be treated differently to any other disease, and would hope that we would extend the same standard of care and compassion to a patient with AIDS as to a patient with any other potentially fatal disease. We have all taken blood for Wassermann reaction, for example, on antenatal patients, and never sought patient consent or explained the catastrophic social consequences if a test were to prove to be positive. Secondly, your stress on confidentiality towards patients is irrational when in the same paper you insist that a doctor counselling a colleague who is HIV positive must inform on that colleague should he or she not accept the advice on changing practice offered. we would respectfully suggest that the General Medical Council reconsiders the advice to the profession. It's our view that if the legal advice used by the GMC is valid in law, then the law requires amendment. So that's the view being expressed by the Area Medical Committee. If we go over the page, we see then a supporting letter from Dr. Taylor in Inverness. Thank you for forwarding the correspondence on this subject. Our department would give the strongest possible support to the views expressed by Dr. McClure in his letter to Dr. Patterson. Now, whether that's referring to the same letter or not is unclear, but we've received these documents together. But the issue is clear from the remainder of the sentence, i.e., we feel it's inappropriate, unethical and illogical that we have to seek patient consent before testing for HIV. That would appear to be a pretty clear expression of Dr. Taylor's views as at 1988, that it was positively inappropriate, unethical and illogical to seek patient consent before undertaking HIV testing. In terms of the numbers infected with HIV in Inverness, the conclusion, as we understand it, of the Penrose inquiry, although it was told by the director of the centre in 2011 that there were no haemophilia patients considered to have been infected with HIV as a result of treatment in Inverness, the Penrose inquiry's conclusion was that there were 2 patients. And that's consistent with the provisional data that we have received from the UKHCDO. So if we go to INQY 40250, and we go to the last page, this is the table the inquiry has put together from the data it's received from UKHCDO. Inverness is the last hospital, last centre identified, and it records there, according, as we understand it, to information held on the National Haemophilia database, 2 patients testing positive in 1985. In terms of the arrangements in relation to hepatitis C, we've little by way of documentary evidence. There's evidence the inquiry has received from patients about being informed about hepatitis C diagnosis at routine appointments, which is a not unfamiliar story. The Penrose inquiry's conclusion, again in relation to patients with hepatitis C, was that as at 2011, there were 26 living patients infected with hepatitis C at Inverness. So that's the position in relation to Inverness. You'll just forgive me for a moment while I rearrange bundles. I'm going to turn to Aberdeen. So, Aberdeen Haemophilia Centre, located at the Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. Director was Dr. Audrey Dawson from 1967 to 1996. She's provided a statement to the inquiry which says she shared responsibilities as a team with Dr. King, who was a paediatric haematologist, and Dr. Bennett, who was a consultant haematologist. Dr. Dawson says that she spent much of her time developing the service for leukemia and lymphoma and other malignant haematology services, and that Dr. Bennett was effectively the person with expertise in bleeding conditions, but she was officially the haemophilia director from that period, 67 to 1966. Dr. King has also provided a statement to the inquiry about his role at the Royal Aberdeen Children's Hospital and his role as a paediatric haematologist. We've also a statement from Gina Andrew, who was a nurse at the Aberdeen Royal Infirmary and working there in relation to the care of patients with bleeding disorders from 1985 to 1987. And she's provided us with a description of the facilities in terms of haematology beds, based in Ward 41 in the Royal Infirmary, about 9 beds, and then it split off and moved to Ward 16 in around 1987, and then Ward 112. As with Inverness, there's a close relationship between the blood transfusion service and the Haemophilia Centre. So the Aberdeen and North East of Scotland blood transfusion service was also based at the Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. The director of that service was Dr. Brodie Lewis in the 1970s, and then Dr. Stan Urbaniak became the regional director in November 1982. Again, their role and policies and decision-making will be explored in more detail in later hearings. But Dr. Dawson, in her statement to the inquiry, talks about the relationship between the Haemophilia Centre and the Blood Transfusion Service, explaining that the Haemophilia Centre received concentrates from the blood bank in the local blood transfusion service, mostly SNBTS concentrates, and she describes the blood bank staff keeping details of the amount of products used issued to each patient throughout the year. She says there was a good relationship with the blood transfusion service, that the transfusion service played a key role in maintaining records of treatment use. And she says there were many discussions between the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service and the Regional Transfusion Service about the risk of infection from blood and blood products. She says these weren't informal meetings, but we tried to make the best decisions that we could based on what was known at the time. If we go to STHB 40568, we can see a letter Dr. Dawson wrote to the Penrose, or what wrote around the time of the Penrose inquiry. If we just pick it up where she says we would like to make the following comments, paragraph 1. I should say she explains that this is following discussions she'd had with Dr. Bennett. She says, we had several patients whose exposure to commercial concentrates before arrival was not accurately known to us. Aberdeen and North East Scotland in the 70s, 80s were experiencing an economic boom related to North Sea oil, and we had many incomers, often transient. One man I remember treating was French, working offshore on a total rig, having not admitted to his French employers that he had haemophilia. There were also several other haemophiliacs who were transient in Grampian, either working or on holiday. Also, our native patients, even although treated probably exclusively with NEBTS material in Aberdeen, would have been exposed to commercial products when away from North East Scotland. And then she says in paragraph 2, with regard to the records of material which were used in treatment, the North East Blood Transfusion Service actually obtained the material for us and kept detailed records of batch numbers, etc., while we, i.e. Haemophilia Centre, kept only minimal records of this in the clinic/ward, and this mainly related to the amount and type of material. Even these latter records would have fallen victim to the Grampian clinical record system, where material which was considered transitory was culled in the 1980s in order to try and contain the bulk of the clinical notes. So that was her recollection as set out in a letter to the Penrose inquiry. If we then look at the annual returns, we can pick it up with 1976 HCDO 302429. We can see Dr. Dawson there identified as director, haemophilic patients treated during the year 9. And then in terms of the products used, 49,630 units of cryoprecipitate, 818,000, it looks like 450 units of Edinburgh factor 8 concentrate. And then really it's a similar position in 1977. I won't go to that return. 14 haemophilia A, 5 von Willebrand's patients treated. Treatment is cryoprecipitate in Edinburgh, NHS factor 8. But if we go to the return for 1978, HCDO 302431, we can see 16 patients, haemophilic patients treated during the year, one with antibodies. And then in terms of the treatment, 77,760 units of cryo, 96,370 units of Edinburgh factor 8, but then a small amount of commercial product, so Hemophilia being used. It looks like 4,590 for the first time in the returns that we have. And there's a similar picture, again, I won't go through each of the documents on the screen, but there's a similar picture for 1979. Cryoprecipitate Edinburgh factor concentrates, and then a similar amount of Hemophilia being used. Also FEBA for the first time recorded for 1979. And then we see FEBA being recorded in 1980 and 1981 and 1982. As well as cryoprecipitate Edinburgh NHS factor products. We don't see Hemophilia or any other commercial concentrate recorded after 1979. If we then pick matters up in 1983, HCDO 302436, we can see the directors identified Dr. Bennett and Dr. Dawson jointly, 12 haemophilia A patients, 1 carrier, 8 von Willebrand's patients treated. We can see the bulk of the treatment for home treatment, in fact exclusively, is the NHS factor 8 concentrates, again presumably the Edinburgh concentrate, 255,908 units. 87,000 odd units being used in hospital, cryoprecipitate being used only for the treatment of von Willebrand's patients, and a small amount of NHS concentrate being used for the same purpose. And then we can see bottom of the page a small amount of porcine factor 8 concentrate, and then a much larger quantity, 246,000 units of FEBA. And then I don't think we have the return in terms of Hemophilia B, but the pattern, as far as we can see, is Edinburgh concentrates only. And then 1984 is a similar picture, HCDO 302437. We can see 16 Hemophilia A patients, 2 carriers, 9 von Willebrand's patients, a very small amount of cryoprecipitate being used for the treatment of Hemophilia A patients, but the bulk of the treatment is with the NHS concentrate, again presumably, I think, Edinburgh concentrate, and there's a reference there to material sent to the islands. And then a small amount of cryoprecipitate used for carriers of Hemophilia A and von Willebrand's, and reference there to factor 9 being used, again in a small quantity. And then it's a similar picture in relation to 1985. I won't go to the return itself. We have 18 Hemophilia A, 2 von Willebrand's patients treated that year, 1 Hemophilia B patient, cryo, Edinburgh NHS products, FEBA, and plasma recorded. In terms of paediatric patients, Dr. King has indicated in his statement to the inquiry, in terms of figures of patients, that as at 1985, he thinks there were 3 severe Hemophilia A patients, 4 Hemophilia A patients who were mild or moderate, no Hemophilia B patients, and 5 with von Willebrand's disease. Dr. Dawson, in her statement, has said that due to the passage of time, she's got little or no recall of the processes in place for ordering factor concentrates. Her recollection is that they were sourced from the PFC, or the blood products were sourced from the PFC in Edinburgh, And she says, when we didn't have enough of a product, we would have used commercial factor, although I think in Aberdeen that was rarely the case. And that appears to be generally borne out by the returns. There is one additional document which indicates the purchase of Hemophilia in 1979. That is at SBTS 40233_008. I think I said it wrong. SBTS 0000223_008. And it's headed purchase of commercial blood products as reported by transfusion directors. For Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, we see they're recorded Hemophilia. It's a larger number of units than appears on the annual return. 9,780 units the year to the 31st of August 79, fever, and then buminate, which I think is albumin. They're recorded.
Can we just go back to 2432, HCDO 302432? Okay, scroll down a bit, please. Yes, that's what I thought. The number of units there is 4,860. Yes. We go back to what we've just been looking at, SBTS 223_008.
It's 9,000.
Yeah.
Yes.
Double, almost.
Yes. We don't know whether that relates to a longer time period or we don't know what the explanation for that is.
Because if it's the two added together, because there's no Hemophilia after 1979, the first bit of tiny Hemophilia was in 78, 2431. That's 302431, HCDO.
It's not far off the amounts recorded for 78.
Well, it's exactly the same, pretty much.
It's about 30 units out, I think, on my quick mental arithmetic.
Yes, it doesn't add up. Not exactly.
No.
And yet the figures are quite specific.
Yes, that's the data that we have. The conclusion of the Penrose inquiry in terms of what was being done at Aberdeen was that the use of imported commercial concentrates was very infrequent throughout the material time. That at least appears to be borne out by the returns that we have. In terms of the approach to treatment, Dr. Dawson has said in her statement to the inquiry that most of the boys and men that we treated had severe haemophilia and so had no alternative to factor concentrates. So that was her perspective. Her view was that home therapy with cryoprecipitate wasn't much of an option. Gina Andrew, the nurse, recalls Dr. Dawson and Dr. Bennett as being keen to get as many patients as possible onto home treatment. And she describes, this is the nurse who describes how once most of the patients were on home treatment, the numbers coming into the ward decreased dramatically as they no longer required admission. Dr. Dawson's recollection is that for mild haemophiliacs, DDAVP would have been used. We don't see it recorded on the annual returns, but then that's been quite a common feature in different parts of the United Kingdom. In terms of knowledge of risk of hepatitis, Dr. Dawson's told the inquiry that she was aware in the early 1970s that hepatitis B could be transmitted by blood. She's told the inquiry that in the 1970s she became aware of non-A, non-B hepatitis. In common, again, with other centres, we see data being provided to Oxford, which recorded cases of jaundice, and Dr. Dawson, along with other directors participating in the UK HCDO's hepatitis survey. Dr. Dawson attended a number of UK HCDO meetings in the 1970s, so she was there in 1971, where Dr. Biggs summarised her report on the incidence of jaundice and inhibitors. Dr. Dawson and Dr. Bennett both attended the 1972 UK HCDO meeting. Again, there was a discussion about jaundice. Dr. Dawson was there in November 1974, when not only was there a further update from Dr. Biggs about the jaundice survey, but Dr. Krask discussed the epidemic or outbreak of hepatitis in Bournemouth from commercial products. She attended in 1975, where there was again a discussion about hepatitis, and in 1979, when Dr. Krask again presented material about non-A, non-B hepatitis. What she said to the inquiry was that when she became aware of non-A, non-B hepatitis in the 70s, it did not change treatment much, as it did not appear to be a progressive condition, and none of the patients were dying of liver disease, but would have suffered seriously if we'd stopped their factor VIII treatment. In terms of knowledge of AIDS, again, Dr. Dawson, as a centre director, would have had access to the minutes of the UK HCDO meetings, or such meetings as she was herself unable to attend. She's said in her statement that the risk of AIDS was highlighted in meetings of the Scottish Haemophilia Centre directors. She wasn't at that January 1983 meeting that we looked at a few minutes ago, but she was, I think Dr. Bennett, I'll double check, I think Dr. Bennett was in attendance at that meeting. There are various Scottish meetings, 1985, 1986, and UK HCDO meetings where either Dr. Dawson or Dr. Bennett attend. So while there are no particular documents to refer you to, no reason to think that they would have been any less equipped to follow reports in the medical press and what was being discussed at meetings than anyone else. In terms of the process of testing, we have relatively little information about the process itself, but in terms of patients being told of their diagnosis, Dr. Dawson says patients would not have been told as a group, but in individual appointments. There is one patient who has told the inquiry that he was informed of his HIV infection face-to-face by Dr. Bennett in a side room, recalls no real information being provided. Dr. Dawson doesn't think the testing of family members was offered as a matter of routine, but said it would have been available if the request was made. In terms of the treatment of patients with HIV, she said there would have been referral to colleagues in the infection unit locally. And then if we look at I think I've got the right note here. SBTS 40652_083. That's it. This is a 1990 letter from Dr. Dawson to Professor Cash, referring to a letter she's received from a lawyer representing a haemophiliac with inhibitors, who says was known to be HIV positive in October 1985. That is the first test which was performed that we have records of, and there's no blood stored before that time. So that might assist in giving some indication about the timings for the undertaking of HTLV3 tests in relation to Aberdeen patients. Dr. Cash's response is at SBTS 40635_069. Um, 11th of January 1991. He refers to how Dr. Urbaniak will provide the details he requires, but his observation is it should be a fascinating investigation. My money would be on the fever, presumably as the source of the infection is what he's saying. We looked a few minutes ago in the context of Inverness at that letter from from David Waters of the Haemophilia Society, May 1989, to Dr. Ritzer. I won't go back to it, but you'll recall from it that as well as referring to an Inverness patient not being advised of HIV status. The letter referred to 2 patients at Aberdeen where there was a long delay in the diagnosis being provided to the patient or families. In terms of numbers affected with HIV, Dr. Dawson's recollection was that there were 3 patients at the centre infected with HIV, all of whom had severe haemophilia A. The evidence provided by the subsequent director, Dr. Henry Watson, to the Penrose inquiry, again, was of 3 patients. That evidence suggested 2 had severe haemophilia A, 1 had moderate haemophilia A. But the Penrose inquiry then received information from UKHCDO to suggest that there were 7 patients associated with Aberdeen who tested positive for HIV. And that's consistent again with the data the UKHCDO has supplied to the inquiry at INQY 40250. And if we go to the last page, we can see Aberdeen is centre 160, and there is identified a total of 7 HIV cases to 1988. The data there would suggest that UKHCDO holds some records that would indicate tests being carried out on stored samples, because we have 1 test attributed to 1982, or 1 result, I should say, attributed to 1982, 1 1984, 4 1985, and 1 in 1986, giving the total of 7 HIV cases.
Seems a strange discrepancy, the 3 as against the 7.
Yes. And it may be a matter we'll need to try and investigate more, but as I say, it did come up following the Penrose inquiry report set out its analysis of those 3 cases, and then there was later information received by the Penrose inquiry to suggest 7. So what the difference is between, on the one hand, Dr. Dawson's recollection, which may, for all we know, be not an independent recollection, but based upon what she understands was said to the Penrose inquiry, or may indeed be her own independent recollection. What explains that on the one hand as against the UKHCDO data that it then supplied to Penrose and has supplied to us? We don't know. In terms of testing for hepatitis C, Dr. Dawson's evidence to the inquiry says that upon the advent of hepatitis C testing, the centre tested some of the patients, but she says we didn't know what to tell the patients because we were not sure how the virus behaved and whether having it meant that the patients would go on to have liver disease or be able to transmit it or not. She said in a statement there was a policy of offering hepatitis C testing to all patients who came to attention and who'd had treatment with factor concentrates in the 70s and 80s. It's not entirely clear what's meant by came to attention. It may be that that's patients as and when they presented at the centre on a routine appointment were tested, rather than a proactive reaching out to the patients. Again, not dissimilar to accounts we've heard in relation to other centres across the United Kingdom. The inquirers received statements from individuals or their families critical about how the information about hepatitis C was provided to them. There's one witness, for example, who describes finding out about her infection when Dr. Dawson walked into the room and said, make sure you put the tissues in the red bin, we don't want to catch anything from you. And it was only when the patient asked about it that she says the doctor said I had hepatitis C. Similarly, there are concerns expressed by witnesses that they were not given clear information about what hepatitis C was or how they should understand its implications. Dr. King has indicated that 1 paediatric patient was infected with hepatitis C. In terms of treatment for hepatitis C, Dr. Dawson has referred to the use of interferon. She recalls telling patients that the most common side effect was feeling as if you had flu. Again, others have recorded doctors giving that as the indication, but the real experience being very different. So that's the picture in relation to Aberdeen. The third Scottish centre I'm going to turn to is Dundee. It might be sensible we take a short break now, because I won't complete, although it's relatively short, I won't complete it in 5 minutes.
Yes, well, we'll take a break for just over 20 minutes and come back at past.
Yes, so I should say it's apparent that I'm not going to get through all of the rest of the centres today without doing an injustice to the individual centres. So I certainly am not going to get to Cambridge or Norfolk and Norwich. I'll be able to complete Dundee and Bristol, possibly also Truro, and we'll have to see where we get to with Southampton as to whether we're able to do that appropriately or not.
East Anglia will have to wait.
It might have to wait. And I apologise to those who had any particular interest in hearing that evidence.